The third morning of November, at Harrowmere, the great bell in the west corridor rang 11 times before anyone thought to answer it. Esther Vane had been counting. She stood at the linen press on the second floor with her arms full of folded sheets, and she counted the rings the way she counted everything in that house, because counting was the only form of protest a lady's maid was permitted. 11 rings. The bell belonged to the blue bedchamber, and the blue bedchamber belonged to the master of Harrowmere. And the master of Harrowmere had come home 9 days ago, after 4 years abroad, and in those 9 days the house had learned exactly 2 things about him. He was cold, he was rich. Neither fact had produced a footman on the stairs. She heard the housekeeper's voice below, pitched to Carrie, saying that his lordship had a fever, and that a fever was catching, and that no sensible person went into a sick room without being ordered twice. She heard the second footman agree. She heard the cook agree. She heard someone laugh low and say that the new Viscount would find the bell pull broken by Thursday if he kept at it. Esther set down the sheets. She was 24 years old, and she had been in service at Harrowmere for 6 years, and in those 6 years she had learned that the house ran on a kind of arithmetic. A person's worth was calculated from their wages, their birth, and the number of people obliged to notice them. By that arithmetic, she came out to nearly nothing. She was the maid the upper servants called the mouse when they troubled to name her at all, and she had heard the word so often that it had stopped landing on her skin and started living underneath it. The bell rang a 12th time. What she did not yet know, going up that corridor with her sleeves already pushed back, was that the man in the blue bedchamber was not ill at all, and that he had been lying in that bed for 9 days, for one reason only, and that she was about to give him the answer he had been dreading since the day he came home. She knocked once and went in. The room was dark. The curtains had been drawn against a light that would have been good for him, and the fire had gone low, and the air had that flat closed quality of a room where nobody had opened a window because nobody had wanted to stay long enough to. On the table by the bed sat a tray. The broth on it had congealed. Beside it lay a folded cloth, dry, which meant that whoever had brought the tray had brought it no further than the table and had left again without touching him. The man in the bed watched her from under his arm. Julian Crewe, Viscount Harrowmere, was 34 years old, and he had a soldier's shoulders gone slightly thin from a sea voyage, and a face that gave nothing away by long practice. His dark hair was damp at the temples. His jaw was rough with 3 days of neglect. He did not look at her the way the other servants had described him looking at people, which was to say, through them. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has been waiting on. "You rang, my lord," Esther said. 12 times, he said, his voice low. "I counted." Something happened in his face then. It was very small. It was gone before she could name it. She did not curtsy again, because her hands were already busy. She crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back a foot, and the gray November light came in and found the room and showed it for what it was, which was a sick room kept by nobody. She looked at the fire and saw that it had not been made up since the night before. She looked at the water jug and saw that it was full, which meant it had never once been poured. She turned around. "How long since anyone has washed your face?" she said. The Viscount did not answer. He had the look of a man performing an arithmetic of his own and finding the total unexpected. Esther did not wait for permission. She had stopped waiting for permission somewhere around her 2nd year in that house. In the small private way that costs a servant her position if she is caught at it, she poured water into the basin. She took the dry cloth from the tray and wet it, and wrung it out, and she came to the side of the bed and stood there a moment, and then she said, plainly, "I am going to put this on your forehead. It will be cold. You are not afraid of the fever," he said. "I am afraid of a great many things, my lord. That is not one of them." She laid the cloth across his brow. His breath went out of him all at once, and she felt it move across her wrist, warm, and she did not step back. That was the thing she would think about later in her own room, with the candle guttering and her hands unaccountably unsteady. She had not stepped back. She stayed 40 minutes. She built up the fire and did not once say that it should have been built up hours ago. She did it the way she did everything, which was quickly and without ceremony, raking the dead ash forward and laying the coals in the pattern her father had taught her at a schoolroom grate in Wiltshire when she was 7 years old. Small at the base, a hollow in the middle for the air. The fire caught in under a minute, and the room began, grudgingly, to be a place where a person might live. She opened the window 2 inches. The cold came in off the park and cut the flat-closed smell of the room, and the man in the bed made a low sound that she chose to interpret as approval. She found his shaving things on the washstand where they had sat untouched for 9 days, and she did not offer to use them because there were limits, and she knew where they were. But she moved them into the light so that a man with hands might reach them. She took the water jug that had never been poured and poured it. She straightened the counterpane at the foot of the bed, and in doing so, she saw that the bedclothes had not been changed since he had lain down in them, and she made a note of it in the ledger she kept behind her eyes, which was the only ledger in that house that balanced. He did not speak again. He watched her cross the room and cross it back. Twice, she felt his attention move to her hands and stop there. She emptied the congealed broth into the slop pail without comment and rang down for fresh. Nothing came. She waited 11 minutes by the clock on the mantel, which was a clock that had been wound every day of 9 days by somebody who had come no further than the table, and then she went down herself. The kitchen at Harrowmere was warm and low and full of steam, and the whole of the lower house was in it, because a house with a sick master upstairs has very little to do and a great deal to say about it. Mrs. Paget had a knife and a shoulder of mutton. Bess Noel was at the scullery door with her sleeves to the elbow and her cough going. The second footman sat on the corner of the table where he was not permitted to sit, and did not get off it. Esther set the bowl on the boards and said that the blue bedchamber wanted broth. The knife did not stop. "It rang," Mrs. Micah. Paget said. "We heard it ring." "Then you will have heard it ring 12 times. The cook looked at her over the copper, and the kitchen went quiet in the way kitchens do when the mouse says a whole sentence, and then Mrs. Braille. Paget said the word. "Sent the mouse, has he?" Mrs. Paget said. "To no one and to everyone. Well, someone must go, I suppose. Better her than a girl with prospects." The kitchen laughed the way kitchens laugh. Warmly and without cruelty, and without kindness either. And Esther took the bowl and said thank you, and went back up the stairs. Her face was hot. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had learned young that those 2 facts could exist at once in a body, and that only one of them was anybody's business. She fed him the broth herself because his hands, when he reached for the spoon, did something she pretended not to see. They shook, not with fever. She had touched his brow, and his brow was cool as a stone in a stream, and she had known, within the first minute of entering that room, exactly what she was looking at, and she had decided within the second minute to say nothing at all. That was the first thing Julian did not understand about her. Harrowmere had 11 indoor servants, a steward, and a dowager. The dowager was Lady Ophelia Crewe, and she had run the house for 19 years, while her nephew was elsewhere being useful to the crown, and she had run it well, by which she meant that she had run it exactly as it had always been run. She was 61. She kept a fan. She did not need, in a house that was never warm enough to require one, and she held that fan at a height that told the room precisely how much of her attention it had been allotted. She had greeted her nephew's return with a dinner for 30, and a seating plan that placed Miss Cordelia Frayne at his right hand. Miss Frayne was 22, and she had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and she had every reason to believe it. She was the daughter of the neighboring estate. She played well. She had a laugh that arrived slightly before the joke, and a way of resting her glove on a sleeve that did not quite constitute a touch. She had been at Harrowmere every day of the 9 days, and she had not once gone up the stairs. Nobody thought worse of her for it. A gently born young woman did not enter a sick man's chamber. That was what maids were for. And the house had found itself a maid. The Viscount's fever, the house agreed, was persistent. On the 5th day of it, which was the 14th of November, Esther came up at dawn with the coal scuttle and found him sitting on the edge of the bed with his shirt open at the throat and a letter in his hand. He put the letter under the pillow before she had crossed the threshold. "You are early," he said. "The fire is early. My lord, I only come with it." She knelt at the grate. She could feel him watching her, and the watching was not the kind she had learned to weather from footmen and grooms and gentlemen visitors. It had no appetite in it. It was more like the attention a man pays to a language he has been told he cannot learn. "Vain," he said. "My lord, the house believes I am dying. The house believes a great many things. And you." She set the last coal and sat back on her heels and looked at him directly, which was a thing a maid did not do, and which she had considered carefully before doing. "I believe you are cold," she said, "and that the fire is not laid." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the distant relation of one. "Sit down," he said. "My lord, I cannot." "Sit down, Miss Vane." She sat on the edge of the fireside chair with her back straight and her hands folded and the coal dust black on her fingers, and he asked her, in the level voice she was beginning to hear the shape of, how long she had been in the house. 6 years, she said. Before that, she said, and then did not finish, and he did not press her, and she was grateful for it in a way that frightened her. He asked her instead what she read. It was such an absurd question from such a man in such a room that she answered it honestly before she could stop herself. She said that there was a library on the ground floor with a window seat that caught the last of the afternoon, and that she had, over 6 years, read 140 of its books, and that she put each one back exactly as she found it, and that she supposed she should be dismissed for it. 140, he said. "Yes, my lord." Which was the worst of them? She told him. He laughed. It was a rough, unused sound, like a hinge that had not turned in some years, and it stopped almost as soon as it began, and something behind his eyes went shut like a door in a draught. He lay back down. "You may go," he said, and his voice was cold as slate. And Esther rose and curtsied and went, and she carried that coldness down the stairs and into the linen press, and turned it over for an hour, and she understood it exactly, as her wound had trained her to understand it. He had remembered what she was. That was all. A man laughs at a servant's joke and then recalls, mid-breath, that he has laughed at a servant's joke, and the recollection puts the room back in order. She was wrong about that, and she would go on being wrong about it for a long while yet. And everything that followed grew out of the shape of her being wrong. Downstairs, the dowager had begun to press. Lady Ophelia had not survived 19 years of running a great house by failing to notice things. She had noticed that the tray came back empty. Now she had noticed that the blue bedchamber's fire was hot at 6 in the morning. She had noticed, and this was the part that put a coolness into her voice, that her nephew had not asked for the physician a single time in 11 days, and that a man with a real fever asks for a physician. She sent for the maid. The dowager's morning room was small and yellow and very warm, and Miss Frayne sat in the window with her embroidery, and Lady Ophelia sat with her fan, held at the height reserved for people whose names she had elected to learn but not to use. "You have been attending my nephew," she said. "Yes, my lady, he speaks to you." "He gives me orders, my lady." "Of course he does." The fan moved once. "You will understand, I hope, that a household is a delicate machine. A man returning from 4 years of war does not know his own mind. He mistakes proximity for regard. He mistakes a nurse for a companion. It has ruined better houses than this one." "Yes, my lady." "You have no family, I think?" "No, my lady." "Then there is no one to be embarrassed." Lady Ophelia said it kindly. That was the worst of her. And Esther understood it even then, that the woman meant it kindly. "Miss Frayne will be mistress here by the spring." "You are a sensible creature." Sensible creatures do not require a second conversation. From the window, Miss Frayne did not look up from her embroidery. "She is the little gray one, is she not?" she said pleasantly to the room. "The mouse." "Aunt Ophelia, do not be severe with her. Mice cannot help where they are found. The dowager's fan came up half an inch. Esther curtsied. Yes, my lady, she said, because there was nothing else in her mouth that would have been permitted to leave it. She went out. In the corridor, she stopped and put her hand flat on the wall, and the plaster was cold, and she stood there while her heart went on doing what her face refused to. She counted. She got to 40 before it slowed. She thought quite clearly that the dowager had not said one word that was false. There was no family. There was no one to be embarrassed. Miss Frayne would very likely be mistress here by the spring, and the machine would go on running, and a sensible creature would take the warning and be grateful for its mildness. That was the whole trouble with the arithmetic of that house. It always came out. She went up to the 3rd floor and turned the mattresses, all 9 of them, hauling each one over and beating it flat and hauling it back, because there was nothing else to be done with a body in that condition, and because the work was heavy enough to occupy the parts of her that were not to be trusted. By the 4th mattress, her arms had begun to shake. By the 7th, she had stopped hearing the word. She was not crying. She had not cried since the year she was 19. She had simply found that if she worked hard enough, the inside of her head went quiet, and she had built a life out of that discovery. And she was not yet willing to admit that a man in a blue bedchamber had put a crack in it in 12 days. That evening the bell rang once, and she went up. He was standing at the window with his back to the room and his coat on, for the first time in 12 days, and he did not turn around. "Tell me about the coal," he said. "My lord." "The allowance for the servants' hall." "What is it?" she told him. He asked what it had been 6 years ago. She told him that too, and then, because he had asked, and because she had spent the afternoon turning mattresses, she told him the rest of it. That the housemaid, Bess Noel, was 19, and had a cough that came back every winter, and that the coal ran out on the 11th of the month, every month, and that Bess did not report it, because reporting it was how a girl became a girl with a complaint. That the boot boy could not read the labels on the boxes, and had been beaten twice for putting the wrong polish out. That the second footman drank, because his brother had gone down at Badajoz, and the house did not permit him to say so. She stopped. She had said far, far too much. She heard the whole of it come back to her in her own voice, the names, the dates, the 11th of the month, and she understood that she had just handed a Viscount an itemized account of his own household's failures while standing in his bedchamber with a coal scuttle in her hand, and that there was no version of that which ended with her still employed. "My lord, I did not mean to speak so." He did not answer. Julian stood very still at that window for a long moment. The park was black behind the glass, and the room held only the fire, and she watched his shoulders and could read nothing in them at all. "How much coal?" he said. "My lord, I did not mean to speak so." "How much?" she told him. He nodded once at the glass. "Go to bed," he said. "Wand?" And that was the second time she took his coldness downstairs with her and misread it entirely. And by morning, the coal allowance for the servants' hall had been doubled, and no one in that house could account for it, and the housekeeper said it must be the fever. Here is a thing worth staying for. She did not know what she had done. "You already do the fever," the house was told. "Broke on the 18th. It had never existed." Julian had come home from 4 years of doing his country's work in places he did not name to a house he had inherited from a man he had loved, and he had stood in the hall for 11 minutes and understood that he could not tell, from any face in it, whether a single person there had ever seen him at all. So he had gone up the stairs and lain down and rung a bell. It was not a test he had been proud of. It had simply been the only instrument left to a man who had spent 4 years learning that the loyalty a title purchases is not loyalty. What he had not accounted for was the reason. The reason was named Thomas Crewe. He had been Julian's elder brother, older by 4 years, and he had taught Julian to ride on the long avenue at Harrowmere and had signed his letters with a single initial, and had been, by every account, including the reluctant ones, a better man than the one who inherited from him. He had died in that same blue bedchamber at the age of 31, of a low fever that took 9 days about it, while Julian was 200 miles away, being urgently required elsewhere. The letter had reached him 11 days after the burial. He had read it standing up in a courtyard in Portugal in good light, and he had folded it and put it in his breast pocket. And it had lived in that pocket for 4 years, and it lived now under the pillow of the bed his brother had died in. What was in the letter was not important. What was important was the last line of it, written by the vicar of that parish in a careful hand, which reported that the late Viscount had been attended in his final hours by his valet and by no one else, the household having considered the illness a contagious one. Nobody had gone in, that was the whole of the wound, and it was small, and it had made him cold in the specific way that grief makes a man cold, which is not cruelty, but a kind of exhaustion with people. He had lain in that bed for 9 days to learn whether the house had changed. On the 10th day, the mouse had come up and pulled back the curtain and asked how long since anyone had washed his face. He never told her any of it. That was not the sort of man he was. What he did instead on the 19th of November was walk into the ground-floor library at 4 in the afternoon and find her in the window seat with a book open on her knees and the last of the light on her hair. She stood so fast, the book fell. "My lord, forgive me." "Sit down," he said. "I have no right to be here." Miss Vane, he picked up the book himself and looked at the spine and set it in her hands. "It is my library. I am telling you that you have the right. Sit down." She sat. He did not. He stood by the shelf with one hand flat against the wood, and he asked her what she had been before Harrowmere. And she told him. She told him because the room was warm, and the light was going, and she had run out at last of the strength required to be nothing. She had been a clergyman's daughter. Her father had kept a school in a village in Wiltshire, 20 boys in a room with a bad chimney, and he had taught her Latin because there was nobody else in the house to teach it to in the evenings, and because he could not bear a thing to go unused. She had been able to read Virgil at 11. She had helped him mark the boys' exercises at 14. He had told her more than once, in the tone of a man stating a fact of natural science, that she had the better mind of the two of them, and that it was a great pity about the world. He had died in the February. She was 19, of the same low sort of fever that took everyone in that county sooner or later, and the accounts had come out of the desk afterward. And the accounts had said £300. He had been lending the fees back to the families who could not pay them for 11 years. He had never mentioned it, and there was no note about it, and she had understood standing in that study with the drawer open, that her father had been exactly the man she had thought he was, and that this was going to cost her everything. The man who held the paper took the house. She had been 19, and there had been nowhere to go but into service, and she had gone. She said all of it, plainly. She did not weep. She had done that in the first year on the back stairs of a different house entirely, and had found that it did not settle the debt. £300, he said. "Yes, my lord. You could have married." "I had an offer," she said. The man who took the house. The silence in that library went on a long time. Julian crossed the floor. He stopped an arm's length from her, which was a great deal too close and not close enough for anything. And she stood up because she could not bear to be sitting while he was there. And they were near enough, now that she could see the pulse at his throat, and the gray and the dark of his hair, and neither of them moved. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room. She had been aware of it since the moment he entered. Her body had learned him in 12 days the way it had learned the stairs. He lifted his hand. He did not touch her. He got as far as the air beside her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth come off his fingers, close enough that her breath stopped altogether, and then his hand closed and dropped, and he stepped back. "Esther," he said, her given name, in his voice. She had not heard it spoken aloud by anyone in 6 years. "My lord," she said, and her voice did not hold. "I have wanted to say it for 9 days." He said it level the way he said everything. And that was what made it unsurvivable. "I am aware of what I am. I am aware of what you are. I am telling you what I want regardless, because I have spent 4 years among men who said nothing until it was too late, and I find I have no stomach left for it." She could not speak. "I will not touch you," he said. Not in this house. Not while every pound you eat by comes from my hand. You would never know afterward whether you had chosen it." He went out. Esther stood in the library with the book in her hands until the light was entirely gone, and then she put it back, exactly where she had found it, because that was who she was, and she went up to her room under the roof and sat on the edge of her bed and did not sleep at all. 6 days later, Lady Ophelia gave a ball. It was the last ball of the season in that part of the county, and it had been planned since September, and it was in every particular the announcement of an engagement that had not yet been contracted. 200 candles in the long room, the orchestra from Bath. Miss Frayne, in ice blue with her mother's pearls at her throat and her place at the head of the room, already warm from the general assumption. The Dowager, in the great chair by the terrace doors with her fan, at the height that meant the evening was proceeding correctly. Esther was there because a lady's maid is always there, standing in the passage by the retiring room, with pins in her apron and a needle threaded, waiting for a torn flounce. She had been standing there 2 hours when Lady Ophelia sent for her into the retiring room, in front of 9 women repairing their hair. The Dowager did not raise her voice. She never had to. "My nephew has doubled the coal, changed the physician, dismissed his steward, and written to a solicitor in London," she said. "In 3 weeks, a man does not do these things because he has recovered. He does them because someone has been at him." The fan came up. "Mrs. Paddett tells me the servants' hall has a name for you, the mouse. I had thought it unkind. I begin to think it flattering. A mouse at least confines itself to the pantry." The room went entirely still. 9 women. Every one of them had heard it. A comb stopped halfway through a coil of hair. Somebody's maid, hired for the evening, held a hairpin in the air, and did not put it anywhere. And every one of the 9 looked away, at the glass, at the fire, at the ceiling, with the particular speed of people who intend to repeat a thing later, and would prefer not to be recalled as having been present when it was said. Esther stood in the middle of it, with a needle threaded and pins in her apron. "You will leave Harrowmere in the morning," Lady Ophelia said. "I will write you a character. It will be a good one. I am not a cruel woman." And that was the terrible part, and Esther knew it standing there with her needle in her hand. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had been right for 61 years about how the world was arranged, and she was defending the arrangement, and the arrangement had a name for Esther, and the name was accurate, and the world agreed. Esther curtsied. "Yes, my lady," she said. "Wah." She went back out into the passage and stood where she had been standing, because there were still 2 hours of dancing left, and a flounce might yet tear. And she found that her hands would not stop, and that her face was wet, and that neither of these things could be permitted. And so she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth, and waited for it to pass. It did not pass. She was still standing there when the music stopped. It stopped in the middle of a set, which does not happen, and the sound of 200 people not talking came down the passage like water. Esther put her head around the door. The Viscount of Harrowmere had crossed the long room. He had done it in a straight line from the terrace doors to the head of the room, past Miss Frayne in her ice blue, and past the great chair, and past the orchestra that had faltered and stopped without being told to, and he had not looked left or right, and he had come out of that room and into the passage where the servants stood, and he was standing in front of Esther Vane, in front of every person in the county. She could not curtsy. Her body had forgotten how. He held out his hand. The whole house watched him do it. Mrs. Paget, from the service door, with a tray gone crooked in her grip. Bess, 19, with both hands over her mouth. The second footman, who had been at Badahouse's edge, in his brother's letters. Miss Frayne, who understood in that 1 second, and whose face did the small, honest thing that faces do before they are told what to do. Lady Ophelia, in the great chair, with the fan stopped dead in the air. Esther did not take his hand. "My lord," she said, and her voice went across that silence like a dropped glass. "I am to go in the morning." Julian did not look at his aunt. He looked at Esther, and he spoke into the silence the room had built for him, and he said at once, "Miss Vane is my betrothed. She stays. I go with her." The fan came down. Lady Ophelia said her nephew's name. She said it again. The second time it came apart in the middle, and she put her hand out to the arm of the chair that had held her for 19 years. And she found the arm, and she sat, and the whole long room saw a woman discover that the arrangement she had spent her life defending had never been the thing that held her up. Nobody spoke. The orchestra from Bath sat with their instruments on their knees. 200 people in the county's best clothes stood in a room lit by 200 candles, and did not have, among all of them, a single word that fitted. Then Bess, 19 years old, and with nothing whatever to lose, began to clap. It was awful for one full second. Then Mrs. Paget set the tray down and joined her, and the second footman joined her, and the boot boy who could not read the polish boxes joined her. And the sound came up out of the service door and into the long room, and the county followed it. Because the county had always followed, that being what a county is for. Miss Frayne crossed the floor. Esther braced for it. Miss Frayne stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment with an expression that had no polish left in it at all. And then she said quietly, so that only the two of them heard, "He never once looked at me like that. I've been trying to think, all evening, what I might have done differently. I've decided the answer is nothing." She inclined her head. "I hope you will be very happy. I mean it. It is a great deal easier to mean than I expected." She went to find her mother. The solicitor was in the library at 11 the following morning, having come up from London on the Viscount's letter of the 19th, and he confirmed in flat professional sentences that a settlement in the name of Esther had been drawn a full week before the ball, and that £300 in interest had been discharged in Wiltshire on the 21st, and that the transaction had required nothing whatever from the Dowager's household accounts. Lady Ophelia heard all of it standing up. When the solicitor had gone, she remained by the window a long while. Then she crossed to where Esther stood, by the door, and she was 61, and she was not accustomed to the shape her mouth was making. "I called you a mouse," she said. "Yes, my lady. My son is buried in that churchyard, and I did not go into his room either." The Dowager's hand tightened on the fan, and then deliberately let go of it. "Thomas, I could not. I told myself it was the contagion. For 19 years, I have run this house on the principle that there are things one does not do." She looked at Esther. "You went in." She did not apologize. She was not a woman who had ever been taught how. She put her hand briefly on Esther's arm, which cost her more, and went out. And by Christmas she had removed herself to the Dower house at Stanwick, and had written in her own hand to invite them both to dine. They were married in the parish church on the 2nd of February. Snow came down on the churchyard all that morning and settled on the stone where Thomas Crewe was buried. And Julian stopped there on the way in, and stood a moment with his hat in his hand and said nothing that anybody heard. Bess threw rice at the gate with her cough entirely gone, 3 winters of it, finished by a doubled coal allowance and a doctor who came when he was sent for. The boot boy, who could read the polish boxes now, held the horses. They did not go abroad. There was nothing abroad that either of them wanted, and the house was warm for the first time in 19 years, and it seemed a waste to leave it. The library at Harrowmere caught the last of the afternoon in a particular way in winter. That was the room Esther chose. On the first evening she was permitted to choose anything, and Julian had a second chair carried in and set at the other end of the window seat without being asked, and they sat there in the early dark of a February that was letting go of its cold, and the fire took the wall of books and made them warm. She had the volume in her lap. It was the 141st, and she had taken it down from the shelf herself in front of a footman, and had not put it back. He was watching her read, which she did badly, and without any pretense of doing otherwise. And after a while she said, without looking up, "There is a letter under that pillow upstairs." "Yes, you will not tell me what is in it." "No."
"Good,"
she said, and turned the page. Outside, the snow came down over the churchyard, and over the Dower House road, and over the long roof of a house that had learned, at some cost, a new arithmetic. Inside, the fire held. Julian Crew put his hand out along the back of the window seat, and did not quite touch her hair, and left it there. Esther leaned back. "Thank you for staying until the end. Some houses are only ever as good as the one person willing to open the door."